think we're ready to begin. We're good? Okay, perfect. All right, welcome to the Northeast Campus Women's History Month Committee presentation. It's so good to see you all here. We will be having food, by the way. I know that some of your instructors may have promised you food. It is coming. It's running a little late, but pizza will arrive, I promise. There are drinks in the back if you are interested, but let's go ahead and get started. Our speaker today is J.L. Tomlin. J.L. Tomlin is a historian of early American religious and political history. He is currently a lecturer at the University of North Texas, so not too far down the road. And beginning in the fall of 2023, he is going to be the assistant professor of history at Fairmont State University, so congratulations on that. His work has been published in both academic and popular journals, including The Age of Revolutions, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, Religious Dispatches, the Omohundro Institute, and others. His first monograph examines the role of popular anti-Catholicism in early American politics, and his new book project studies the rise of sectarian conspiracy theories and the years leading into the American Revolution, which sounds super exciting and interesting. So please help me welcome J.L. Tomlin, who is presenting a very suspicious endeavor, importing European witchcraft to North America.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah, for inviting me, and thank you guys all for having me. Can you hear me okay with the microphone? All of you in the room can hear me okay without the microphone? Okay. So what I am going to talk to you today about, and thanks for inviting me for the Women's History Month event, is the importing of European witchcraft into the colonial United States. And the story I'm going to tell you today starts with King James I, the famous English translator of the Bible. In 1624, the year before he dies, he receives word that there has been an accusation of witchcraft in Virginia, in one of the new colonies he is setting up in his brand new American empire that part of his reign is so focused on building. James is a committed witch hunter. He writes a book called Demonology in 1597, where he tries to set out how experts should deal with. Many of them are there because we didn't want them here. And he says, it's not that I doubt there are witches in British America. What I doubt is that they would know it if they saw one, and what they will accuse people of regarding witchcraft. He says, as far as finding witches in the colonies in the Americas, I find it a very suspicious endeavor. And this is from a witch hunter, someone who prides himself on this. So the story I'm going to tell you today is why he's skeptical. What we're going to look at is a few things, but as an overview, first I want you to get an idea of what we mean when we say witchcraft, because there are definitely different practices that are associated with it, which we kind of forget in popular memory. Second, we want to look at the changes that are ongoing in European society around the time that Americans bring those ideas to the colonies. European society is undergoing a renaissance. They are undergoing a shift in thinking about legal processes, about the separation of church and state, and unfortunately enough, early Americans bring with them ideas of witchcraft that precede those changes, that precede the system kind of evolving to look at it differently. That means that when early Americans bring their notions of what witchcraft means to the New World, they bring a snapshot in time of it, and something that's very much in a process of change or evolution back in Europe. Once they actually make it to early America, there are specifics of early American lived experience which will change concepts of witchcraft, especially because early America is such a diverse space where you have notions of African witchcraft, notions of Native American witchcraft, and then older European notions of witchcraft all merging together, mixing, interacting with each other, and kind of changing each other in that process. That means that by 1700, accusations of witchcraft in early America look very different than what you would see in Europe. And in fact, the punishments by that point are very different as well. So after we filter it through the American experience, we come out with something, an idea of witchcraft that's very different than Europe, punished much more harshly than in Europe, and under a jurisdiction that didn't exist in Europe anymore, specifically church-based courts. So there is something of European witchcraft in early America, But over time, what we find is that Americans make witchcraft something specific to themselves, something that is very much different from Europe or Africa or Asia or any of the other societies at the time that we look at that take notions of magic or behaviors associated with it seriously. Finally, I want you to get a sense of the actual differences that results in. Americans then view witchcraft as a cultural, political, as a religious phenomenon that becomes uniquely American, both in the way we think about it and in the way we apply it. That's going to be something important because at the end, I want to show you how that's still at work in your world today. There are still concepts of witchcraft. There are still concepts of conspiracy, which is a key element behind witchcraft that we still see pervasive in our society, but also incredibly influential, depending on where you look and if you notice that it's witchcraft you're talking about. This is an image of our witch hunter, James. Now, to give you an idea, he has this commissioned, so this is something he wanted you to see. And what it shows him is overseeing the torture of witches. Now, what you're supposed to see in this is not James torturing witches. What you're supposed to see is how rationally he's doing it. James says that we don't want to be like the Spanish Inquisition. We don't want to be like the pogrom-based anti-witch hysteria that we see in some of the German-speaking areas. We want to show people that England has arrived in the Enlightenment, that we are rational, that we are looking at this as a legal process with a standardized system of thinking about it, prosecuting it, and punishing it. How do you do that? Well, you show that our view of prosecuting or finding witches is very much influenced by that Enlightenment thought, right? You see him calmly overseeing the torture. And torture is legal to get a confession in English society up until 1809, I believe. So this is totally legal, and he's showing himself to be a rational, calm supervisor of the process. He has this commissioned in line with his book Demonology, and then a second variation of it he publishes a few years later called Demonology Improved. And in this, he simply lays out, here's how you find witches. Here's what they actually look like. Here's how you know an accusation is real versus fake. Here's how you punish a witch for different kinds of magic. And this is something we forget. Not all forms of magic are viewed as bad. They accept that magic exists, but because they believe it entirely, they actually have kind of an analytical process for viewing the difference between different forms. And that's an important component that James brings to bear in English society. So first, let's look at the kinds of magic, or the forms of witchcraft, if you will. First, we have to ask that question. Why do we even need to differentiate between different concepts of witchcraft? The main reason, and there are a couple, but the main one is because they don't view all forms of magic as negative. James, for instance, sets out in Demonology a differentiation between what he calls folk magic and what he calls malevolent magic. The only difference meaningful to us today is that one causes direct harm to someone. It deprives them of property, of health, of their life. It is essentially magic used as a tool to commit what is already recognized as a crime, something that hurts someone else. On the other hand, there are good forms of magic that are commonly accepted, going back into the pagan tradition in Anglo-Saxon Europe, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. The Romans talk about this as well, so it's a much longer tradition. So how are you going to decide between good magic and bad magic? Witchcraft, like you see here, the common stereotypical depiction of a woman in black riding a broomstick, this is actually not the most prevalent kind of magic they thought was in play in society. The most prevalent kind is what's called divination. Divination is simply someone using hidden power or knowledge to find something out. So, believe it or not, the most commonly practiced form of witchcraft is someone showing up on your property and saying, I can tell you whether or not there's treasure buried on your land. I can tell you whether or not your wife's going to have a son or a daughter. I can tell you how long you'll live. This kind of thing. We know this because they show up in court cases when somebody wasn't able to find treasure, or when the baby turns out to not be a boy or a girl, or when someone dies before the diviners said they were going to. They show up in fraud cases. But notice that they're not prosecuted as witchcraft. They're prosecuted as simple fraud, commercial fraud, because the magic used didn't work appropriately. In none of those cases do we see any punishment for the use of magic itself. It's simply that the magic didn't work. That's what they're being punished for. In all of the court cases we see involving magic in either England or the colonial American space, the colonies themselves, this accounts for 89% of all court cases brought about magic, not this kind of scene. What this refers to is something far more serious, far more serious. It's called ecstatic divination. Some historians call it orgasm-based divination. Essentially what this is using group ecstasy, some kind of meeting, could be sexual, could simply be the energy of music being played, this kind of thing. They use the group as a vessel through which to actually achieve magical powers, usually by forming some kind of union with Satan or Lucifer or a familiar spirit of him, usually depicted as a black dog, a black goat, or a black horse. Ecstatic divination involves practices that at the time were seen as obscene, and today, if we actually saw them in movies like Hocus Pocus, we would be shocked by that as well, right? They are things that involve aspects like infanticide. For instance, if you see a witch riding a broomstick, this means, and it was believed, that this meant that she had had some kind of ecstatic divination. She had formed the union with Satan, possibly had sex with Satan, the powers bestowed upon her as a gift of which were flight. The reason you see them on broomsticks is because they had to use some kind of rudimentary phallus as a sexual practice in order to achieve this. Again, not what makes it into pop cultural representations of witchcraft today, but an important component of how they saw a legitimate magical behavior or practice. It's kind of like a formula or a recipe. They just assumed this was part of it. Just like a communion symbolized or created a bond between you and God that was sealed with a sacrament, this was kind of the inverse of that. Taboo behaviors that formed an anti-communion. And that's very much what they're talking about. A witch's Sabbath is called that explicitly for that reason. It's meant to be an inverse of the Christian gospel, the profanity of which was part of the offense of witchcraft. Does that make sense? This is thought to have happened in only 10% or less of witchcraft cases. And again, I'm going off of James's numbers, his expert analysis of what it looked like. Finally, you have two different separations of this. Most of the time, with witchcraft cases, what they're really referring to is magic being used to commit a crime. So to harm someone, to destroy their property, to bring them bad health, this kind of thing. And what James is pushing heavily for is for witchcraft to be seen as exactly that, as just another form of civil crime. Witchcraft would be then a tool. What you'd be punished for is the crime itself. Witchcraft would be something that's more of like an aggrieving factor, right? Something that adds malice to it, maybe even makes it premeditated, but doesn't necessarily in and of itself constitute a crime. Because before James, witchcraft was seen as a religious crime. And this is an important distinction, because religious crimes don't have standardized punishments by the state. They fall under the jurisdiction of religious courts, again, which before the Protestant Reformation aren't bound by legal rules. They can prosecute someone for anything. They can convict them only with their own authority, and their punishment, usually capital punishment or execution, can be for whatever they feel is evidence enough to prove the crime. James says that this is a relic of the past, and he wants to replace it with this new scientific approach to witchcraft, putting the state in charge of prosecuting it, of discovering it, of punishing it. Unfortunately, James is undergoing a lot of opposition to do this when he tries, which is his reign, 1603 to 1625. And by that point, what he's allowed to have established in the American colonies are, guess what? Systems run by churches. Massachusetts, New Jersey, Maryland all have a religious establishment that controls the court process. Even Virginia, which is the most secular colony and the one that James sees that accusation from, Virginia is still technically run by the Church of England. Beyond the jurisdiction of those civilian courts, James wanted to set up to try witchcraft, which means when you have cases like the Salem witch trials, like the Pendle witch trials, they are tried by religious courts, and the punishments, as you might expect, are not processed by law. That means evidence is introduced that never would have stood up in a civilian court. Punishments are prescribed, which wouldn't have seemed cruel in a civilian punishment system. Unfortunately, when Americans start to search for witches and they start to punish perceived witches, they do it with that old understanding, with the old rules, an unrestrained aspect on witchcraft. that James and the English legal system are desperately kind of trying to push beyond. That's important to remember too. We in the United States, or before the United States, the early colonial period, we execute far more witches than the British do at the same time because their punishments are increasingly becoming misdemeanors. Witchcraft, for instance, after 1707 in Britain is punished with a fine, sometimes with home imprisonment. The most severe punishment in Britain after 1707 for witchcraft is simply having your property seized. There are no more executions. And after 1760, there are no more prosecutions for witchcraft at all. They're simply arbitrated with an intermediary out of court. So the early colonial American space is much more radical on these things than the British at the same time, and that's something to keep in mind as well. Those evolving views are best laid out in a few of the main academic, and I say academic with the strongest of brackets here, but when the academic literature that's coming out about it in the mid-17th century. These are English thinkers, sometimes religious leaders, sometimes scientists, natural scientists, trying to put forward concrete legal processes. We believe magic's real. We know witches are out there. Let's deal with it rationally. Let's have judges that have punishments prescribed before. Let's take the personality aspect out of it. And let's take the taboo component out of it. Take the church, their authority to prosecute it away. One of the most famous of these is A Candle in the Dark, or a treatise on concerning the nature of witches and witchcraft. And this is one of those that's seminal in this academic movement to reimagine witchcraft. For one thing, in 17th century English society, they are beginning to have concepts of racial inferiority or superiority. They're also beginning to have concepts of kind of what we today would call patriarchy or misogyny mixed in with this. Before, in the medieval period, women had been feared as a natural receptacle of magic, of forbidden power, of hidden knowledge. In the early modern period, thinkers in England or the Anglo-Saxon kind of intellectual space are reimagining that to say, could a little girl really be a witch? Could someone who's illiterate really be a witch? Could someone who's not intelligent really be a witch? A lot of people are simply spared suspicion under James's rethinking because they're not seen as having the capacity to use magic, or especially to commit a crime with it. And we have the factor of the other here to consider as well. As the English Empire starts to deal with people of different traditions, different religious backgrounds, and different ethnic backgrounds, what they begin to sense is that, well, although before they suspected that hidden knowledge existed in all societies, they have to justify their feeling of superiority. And part of that is explaining to themselves, well, they can't really be capable of this kind of thing in the way that we're thinking of it. So they start to filter out certain groups that might have been accused before as simply being seen as incapable of witchcraft. This is, again, something that Americans don't do at the same time, and we'll get into why in a second. One of the first examples of this is the trial of Eliza Putnam and the Pendle witches. Eliza's story is really tragic because she turns on her own sister, she eventually turns on her own mother, and then they turn on her, the state. So Eliza's story is one of these warning tales that's leading English thinkers to think that they need to reimagine how you deal with witchcraft. Eliza's walking with her sister, Bethany, on a road into town, an English town called Pendle. As they're walking into town, they pass an old man. They offer to sell the old man one of the apples on their cart. The old man refuses. The older sister, Bethany, curses him. She literally says, "Curse you, you wretch." Around the time that she does this, he has a stroke, kills over, and dies. Her younger sister, Eliza, then goes and says, "I think my sister is a witch." She goes to the deacon of the local church, who then turns it over to the sheriff, and the little girl tells this story. "My sister and I were walking to town. She cursed this man. He dropped dead. And about the same time that he dropped dead, I turned and I saw a black dog standing next to her that I'd never seen before, and I've never seen since. But she had this black dog, and they were talking to each other." The sheriff says, "The dog was talking too." She says, "Definitely, the dog was talking too. I saw both of them in a conversation." This is a big red flag, right? That's a familiar. So Bethany is arrested. Eliza says she saw her commit witchcraft. This is how powerful the belief in this is. Bethany, you know what she says under interrogation? "I think I did do it." She believes in witches as well. She says, "Well, I cursed the man. He dropped dead. Maybe I have got that kind of power. You know, come to think of it, the sheep that my mother has me take care of keep dropping dead too. I think I'm just killing things. So she confesses to something that I don't want to be controversial here, but I doubt she did. She confesses because that's how powerful the belief in it is. She's actually executed 2 months later, but it doesn't stop there. Bethany comes back and says, or Eliza, comes back and says, well, actually, I've seen that same black dog talking to my mother and the innkeeper's wife and the farmer's wife that lives in the property next to ours and the peddler that sets up on the south side of the bridge. I've also seen that black dog there. Sure enough, those people are called in. 4 of the 5 are executed as well, including her mother. When her mother is executed, she becomes an orphan. She's only 9 years old. The state takes over custody and she's housed by the deacon at the local church. She continues, however, to tell the deacon she keeps seeing this black dog. The deacon begins to suspect that she's the familiar of she might be a witch. She is called in, questioned. She has some variations in her story. She doesn't remember it exactly the same way. You must be lying. She's executed as a witch at the age of 10. This is where James gets involved and shuts the whole process down. He overrules the local sheriff and says, you're not doing this scientifically. A 9-year-old girl is not capable of being a witch. Her mother, yes. The sister definitely looked guilty. But the girl, that's where you lost me. That's where credulity was strained for James. And so he is trying to, in his defense, reform this system that he sees as exaggerated, fear-based, and kind of archaic, right? He also says there's a jurisdiction problem. Why is the deacon punishing witches? The deacon hasn't been to law school. He doesn't know about common law. He doesn't know about jurisprudence. He doesn't know the process to interrogate people. For instance, it was illegal in English law to have a 9-year-old's testimony as evidence. You have to be of the age of consent, which was 12 at the time. So a 9-year-old's evidence shouldn't have held up in court on its own. James says it should have been, that should have been inadmissible, that kind of thing. So he is trying to bring in some idea of expertise. And he will actually commission a famous witch court of 6 leading thinkers on this that he will try to rewrite the laws around. Now, these experts recommend some pretty crazy stuff. Moles could be signs of witchcraft. On the other hand, freckles can't. If you can tell the difference, right? This kind of thing, it's laughable now, but this was their approach at something serious, right? A very serious overhaul. There's also the concern of evidence. James decides to make illegal something that had been used since the medieval period to convict witches. It's something called spectral evidence. Does anybody know what spectral evidence is? Yeah.
Somebody says they saw something.
Yeah.
Basically, they say, oh, I witnessed this.
Are you saying you didn't see it? Because that's exactly what a witch would say. See, James says, that's not really good evidence. But before, it could just be, I saw the spirit of someone come through my window and prick me with a pin. I saw the spirit or the ghost of my neighbor kill my dog or poison my cow, or et cetera, et cetera. There doesn't have to be any physical evidence. And the more that you deny it, the more guilty you look. James says, that doesn't work in civilian court. We probably shouldn't be killing people with that kind of evidence. The Americans, on the other hand, they don't get that memo. We keep using it into the 18th century. They also have a problem with confession by torture. Now, English courts in the 1650s decide that torture is not legal to actually get a confession. And then in the 1680s and 90s, they reform the system completely to where torture is illegal completely. So they're getting rid of it. Torture, on the other hand, for a confession, it's taboo, but it's not technically forbidden in the colonies. On the other hand, torture simply as a means of punishment or as a means of imprisonment, that's not really regulated at all. So again, we have this incomplete American version of the European process. The European process is far less harsh. For instance, in the entire 18th century, the British only execute one person for witchcraft. And actually, they're not executed for witchcraft, they're convicted of it. They're executed for a murder that they admitted to, that they thought witchcraft was a part of. The 17th century, we still only have about 50 women and men executed for witchcraft. So very small numbers. For comparison, Spain executes over 1,000 witches in the 1600s. The German-speaking states, if you combine them all as one legal area, they execute over maybe 5,000 during that same period. So the English system is already milder. But they are getting away from corporal punishment or capital punishment. That means execution. The colonies will keep execution as the main crime for witchcraft. After the 1630s, really, James has kind of killed that. You'll see imprisonment, sometimes you'll see property forfeiture. Most of the time, you just are socially ostracized. That's really the extent of the punishment. The colonies, on the other hand, there is almost always a physical punishment for conviction of witchcraft, and in maybe 80% of the cases, there's physical punishment just for suspicion of witchcraft. Simply being accused makes you liable to certain punishments. That's the old system that Americans keep that the English get rid of themselves. So the American experience then is already very different, but it's also made more different by the realities of the American colonies that the British don't have. The most important one is the ethnic and religious diversity of early America. By the time you have white Europeans arriving in English colonies, you also simultaneously have Africans and then African Americans arriving in the colonies, literally at the same time. You also have dozens, just on the East Coast alone, of native societies, not monolithic, with different views on witchcraft, some more accessible to European understanding, some not, some with more taboo views, some where witchcraft was simply accepted and tolerated as normal. So you've got an environment where very, very different concepts of witchcraft are merging. That also creates a kind of unstable or kind of unpredictable environment, especially when you have a society that is both convinced witchcraft is real, but increasingly not convinced with how to deal with it. Does that make sense? A society in flux. One of the big things that's different is who is most likely to be accused. In European society, it's almost always women, it's almost always either very young or very old women, and it's almost always marginalized women. People living on the margins either economically or socially. In the colonies, it's very, very different. You see elites accused of witchcraft. You see just about anybody in society, men, women, old, young, middle-aged. You even see infants accused of witchcraft in the American colonies, not something that you ever see that I can find a record of in England itself. So very, very different viewpoint immediately. The second thing is who's most likely to be an accuser. To be accused of witchcraft in England or anywhere in Europe, you had to be accused by the church. You had to be brought up on suspicion by a local religious leader or political leader, so the state's involved from the beginning. It's only really in the American colonies that you see private accusations that are acted upon. Now, it's not that you don't see private accusations in Europe, it's simply that's what starts a case, but then the state gets involved. On the other hand, in the American colonies, simply being accused is enough to land you in jail. Simply being accused is enough for a wide-ranging investigation to start. And it's not necessarily the fact that the state will be doing it. Could be the church, could be a local political leader. It could be the accuser's family themselves. We see this in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire, for instance. The other difference is Americans have that older view of magical power. By 1700, magic's just bad in England. No kind of hidden knowledge is good. No kind of magic is good. There's simply no socially acceptable practices of magic. But in the colonies, especially in New England, there's a very divergent older view. Again, they'll see divination as not so really much a bad thing as just something that could be abused. But they believe that people can do it. Joseph Smith, for instance, the founder of the Mormon Church, he was a famous diviner. Believe it or not, he has a lot of success doing it. He actually finds gold on 2 of the properties he looks at. So this is an accepted commercial transaction, and it's not something that most Americans, especially in New England, were willing to look at as taboo. That's simply an acceptable form of folk magic. Healers are another thing. People that could make livestock recover from illness. People that had secret knowledge of how to heal someone after childbirth. There was a belief that that existed, and as long as it was used for good, this is a positive witchcraft. This is a good magic, as Cotton Mather calls it. And so that's an acceptable thing. Not something you would have seen in England itself. The main difference I've been leading up to, and I've already mentioned this before, is that the separation of church and state that James makes complete by the 1630s in England never really happens in the colonies, at least not until the United States itself is in existence, way later. In the colonies, you have religious establishments that control the courts in every one of the colonies that we see witchcraft accusations brought. That's not coincidental. They have the lower standard or burden of proof, they have a lower standard or burden of evidence, and they have harsher punishments. It's not coincidental that the only 7 colonies we see witchcraft accusations or prosecutions in, 6 of which actually have punishments for it, they're all controlled by state churches. So in New England, it's the Congregationalists. In Pennsylvania, it's the Quakers. In Virginia, Maryland, it's the Anglican Church. But in all of these cases, it is a non-separated church and state process that leads to accusations, prosecutions, and punishment. That's something, again, James had made explicitly forbidden. He says it's just too much temptation for avarice, is what he calls it. I think what he's getting at, though, is they want a more modern legal burden of proof. And if you leave that kind of decision in the church courts, they simply don't have to have that. This is also the reason that if you look at early American witchcraft cases, 95% of them are in New England, again, where church courts have more power. In the South, especially, these are more royal colonies. These have some jurisdiction overlapping with, say, the Board of Trade or with Parliament itself directly. So you'd have more likelihood for those cases to get intervened with, to be kind of stopped in their process. In New England, that's not the case, and that's why and let me repeat that, every one of the executions for witchcraft happened in either Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire. That's because of the nature of the process. The other thing to consider is the function of witchcraft. In English society after the Reformation, the function of the witch in society is a foil to the church. It is a foil to good order and governance. It is a foil to a godly state. But it's not seen as a direct threat to the state. It's not seen as something that will literally be the end of the society if it's not rooted out. This is something far more moderate in witchcraft in the English tradition. On the other hand, keep in mind the realities of early America. You have constant warfare. You have constant social flux of societies vying for resources, territory. You're removed from all of the metropoles of power, of communication. In some ways, you're cut off. And in that kind of environment, fear of these things, paranoia of these things, spreads much further. And it's much more likely to happen in unstable environments. You see accusations of witchcraft uptick anytime there's conflict ongoing, an economic downturn, or simply an influx of immigrants and hostility between existing groups. They almost always overlap with outbreaks of witchcraft. So in early America, the function of the witch then is more an explanation for instability or for an other that you're either afraid of or show hate toward or feel some kind of animosity about, right? Changes, which happen almost constantly, and in early America are almost constantly big changes. That's more likely where you see the function of the witch in their society. The American witch looks very different. Yes, it is disproportionately, again, marginalized women. But remember, that's the European perspective of who's likely to be a witch. After interaction with Africans, with natives, you start to see American concepts of witch become, should I say, egalitarian? Everyone could be accused of any age and of any social status. There are no prosecutions of wealthy or elite or politically connected people for witchcraft in England, ever, that I can find. The only time that is the case is when a king is being deposed and they might have had a bias to calling him a witch for another reason, right? Not once. In early America, on the other hand, 3 of those people executed in the Salem witch trials, for instance, are, by today's terms, millionaires, something unheard of in England. 2 of those executed in Pennsylvania for witchcraft are actually town leaders, the wealthiest people in town, in one case, a mayor. Not something you would have seen. And that's because who will they accept accusations from? In Europe, it had to come from an official channel, which means they're unlikely to target their own. In early America, on the other hand, anybody could accuse anyone of witchcraft and it'd be seen as legitimate. And that means you could have someone with a grudge accuse the wealthiest person in town. All of a sudden, well, how did they get that wealth? Well, why do their crops always do well? How did they get the best property in town? Maybe it is witchcraft. And so then you have the slippery slope where it's kind of a gamut of who can be accused. Early America, again, who could be accused? Maybe we call it more egalitarian. There's also an increasing sense of the other in American accusations of witchcraft. You don't have the racial or cultural diversity in England that you do in the colonies itself, at least not in the 17th and 18th centuries. And that means that you would also see groups accused of witchcraft that have to do more with who they are than what they did. The most famous case being the case of Tituba, who was tied up with the famous Salem witch trials. Now, Tituba is an Afro-Caribbean slave. She's of mixed ethnicity. She also straddles 2 or 3 different religious traditions. She is familiar and was a former practicer of Creole religion in the Caribbean, which is a mixture of Native American and African slave religions that have kind of been simmering in that region for a while. So she has that perspective, what her European enslaver calls a pagan perspective. She also, though, converts to Christianity and becomes a member of the Congregationalist Church. Now, in some ways, this helps Tituba. She's seen as a vital conduit of understanding between these different groups and traditions. On the other hand, when something goes wrong, someone in Tituba's case is the most likely to be accused because she represents someone not fully in whatever group you're talking about. She is a slave, but she has her freedom purchased. She's now an indentured servant working for a share of the profits for a local minister when the Salem witch trials or the Salem witch accusations break out. Tituba is accused of leading young girls to dance in the woods, and they are accused of trying to create charms to make certain local boys fall in love with them. That's not actually what's outrageous, though. It's that they were dancing. Dancing was very forbidden in Puritan society. Dancing in the woods, where the light of Christianity doesn't reach, was especially taboo, and they were doing both simultaneously. The fact that they were using magic to make boys fall in love with them, that's harmless magic. The dancing, though, that they won't have. They bring in the girls, they immediately point out Tituba. Tituba showed us how to do this, it's Tituba's fault. Sure enough, under torture, after 3 days of being tortured, Tituba says, you know what, I did use witchcraft. Because if you admit to it, guess what happens? You get to go home. The torture ends, you're no longer imprisoned. This is another backward thing that the English have stopped doing. If you're convicted, you're punished. But if you confess, you're free to go. They make you sign something legally saying you confess to witchcraft. You essentially are stripped of property. It's not guilt-free, but you're allowed to go home. It's refusing to confess that actually gets you executed in American society. Tituba's not stupid. She figures this out. I can make this all stop if I say, yes, I did witchcraft. So she does, and they let her go. After they let her go, though, they say, who helped you? There's already this sense of the other. It couldn't be you alone. It couldn't have been you powerful enough to do this on your own. There has to have been someone else. One of the accuser's mother has lost 6 children in childbirth. And Tituba says, well, the midwife of our town, she's the one that showed me the secrets of the body and how to make these things happen. Now, one of those accusers' mother has lost 6 children, somewhat under suspicious circumstances, and she says, aha, this is why none of my children survive. The midwife has to be a witch. The midwife is a politically connected person. Tituba's case would never normally in Europe, someone like that to accuse someone like that, never would have gone anywhere. In American society, though, it runs rampant. That one accusation turns into 39, and by the end of the year, 17 people will be executed, all because of this story from Tituba. More accurately, the story the little girls told about Tituba. But you see how this can escalate quickly. And you see how people like Tituba are the first people usually to be victimized, but it doesn't stop there. It spreads further because of this fear that there's this hidden knowledge in society. There's very much what we would today call the conspiratorial style to a lot of this. European accusations of witchcraft tended to focus on a specific thing someone did. American accusations of witchcraft are almost always widespread things. It's not one witch who did something, it's the tip of the spear of a hidden coven of witches in the area doing all kinds of things, pulling all kinds of strings, at work in hidden ways behind almost everything. So there's very much a conspiracy aspect to it, especially by the 1690s, that really separates the American experience from the European one. That's because, as historians like Richard Hofstadter have pointed out, American society from the very beginning has a penchant for conspiracy theory. So going into the American Revolution, the big conspiracy theory was that the king is a secret Catholic. And we know how the Catholics hate democracy. You're aware of that, right? But at the time, they thought that as synonymous. Catholic states have god kings. That means they hate freedom. So Catholics are a secret conspiracy to eradicate freedom. This is actually taken out of the Declaration of Independence, by the way, in one of the edits. Yeah, that's how pervasive it is. Anti-Catholicism turns into other conspiracy theories. The slave conspiracy theory of the North in the 1840s. The abolitionist conspiracy theory in the South in the 1850s and 60s. The immigration conspiracy theory advocated by the nativists in the 1880s and 90s. The anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the 1920s and 30s. Americans love conspiracies, and we can trace it even to today with QAnon. Yes, you can tell people that I tracked a direct line between QAnon and witchcraft. That the Q people will love it, sane people will love it. You can spread that story. So the American experience is a big part of that. The only thing I would add to that, though, is that there is another component, and that is cultural subversives. The image you see on the right here is called the pressing of Giles Corey. Giles Corey is caught up in the Salem witchcraft accusations. He is the only person executed that's not actually executed for witchcraft. He's actually executed, or he's killed under torture, which is not considered state murder. That's a legitimate death by accident because he wouldn't confess. He is pressed to death because he refuses to say that he believes the witchcraft trials are legitimate. See, his wife is one of those accused, and he says, "I never saw my wife commit any witchcraft." They say, "Well, she's accused of it, and she's about to be convicted by the court. So what you're saying is holding contempt for the court." He says, "I think this trial is an entire sham. I think this is people with grievances. I think this is backbiting between families who hate each other. I think this is about property disputes. I don't think there's actual witches in New England." Well, that is a very controversial thing to say. And what it sounds like you're saying is we're making it up, and that this is not a legitimate trial. So they hold him in contempt, and under contempt, he's held first without food and water, and after he refuses to eat or drink, and that hasn't made him say that witchcraft is real and the court is legitimate, then he is put in the stocks, so he's left out in the weather for about a week. When that refuses to break his spirit, they apply heavy stones to him. How you die from this is asphyxiation, but he could have been crushed to death. It's a horrible way to die. His last words are, "More weight." He simply won't give in to the whims of the court and the process that he sees as legitimate. But that's why he's killed. Not because he's suspected of witchcraft, but because he's casting doubt on whether or not it's happening. And that is seen as a threat. So again, something that never would have happened in England itself. Incidentally, Giles's execution is what gets the government to stop the Salem witch trials. Once you've got a person who's not actually been accused of a crime executed by the state simply for holding the process in contempt, that's when the king in England sends a letter to the governor of Massachusetts and says, "You better get a hold of this. I'm trying to show the Enlightenment, Renaissance England. I'm trying to show that we've caught up. We're a legitimate empire, and you're killing people for offending the court. It's making us look bad." Notice the king doesn't say, "I don't think witchcraft is really happening in the colony." He simply says you can't be executing non-witches in witch trials. That's where you went too far. This is a really interesting story, not only because of how out of hand it gets, but because of these different responses you see people having to it. American responses to this are, "Man, I didn't know the conspiracy of witches went so deep." The English response is, maybe killing this one dude was too far. Maybe he was too far to go. So this today to us looks silly, but at the time, what you see is people grappling with what you should take serious about this, with the limitations on what the state can accuse people of, the limitations of punishment for suspicion of things. What they're grappling for is a modern legal structure, but the unfortunate side effects for individuals living through this transition is something far nastier, and from our modern perspective, harsh and unnecessary even. Giles Corey is kind of a warning, because after his execution, you see accusations of witchcraft trail off, By 1741, there are no more in the American colonies. The Congress, the First Continental Congress, outlaws accusations of witchcraft being taken up in court. Again, it's part of this we're an Enlightenment country kind of process the English are going through. But you also see executions for witchcraft almost completely drop off. The last one is in 1731, and again, this is not someone executed for witchcraft. They're executed for using witchcraft to commit a crime they do confess to, which is murdering their husband. So the Giles Corey case is kind of a warning that maybe the society's views on this are changing. What's interesting, though, in hindsight, is how slowly they're changing relative to others. Spain is no longer prosecuting witchcraft by 1692 when this happens. England is prosecuting it, but only with fines, only with property seizure, nothing that would result in anyone dying. The German-speaking areas, the Pope intervenes and says no more witchcraft trials. They're just prevented from doing it ever again. So Americans are behind, in a way, catching up to these scientific views on witchcraft. Now, why does this matter to you today? It's easy to say that early American witchcraft happened in early America, or it didn't happen at all. Early American viewpoints were what dominated accusations of it. Doesn't have anything to do with us today. But that's really untrue when you start to look at what American society and the American experience does to change the concept of witchcraft. For one thing, the function of the witch in society continues to have an effect in our world. You see it in everything from our political system, where we talk about politicized assaults or accusations being witch hunts, right? The inference being that they're not real, that they're not legitimate, that no crime has been done. But you also see it economically in the idea that hidden elites are controlling markets or are stacking the system in their favor with hidden knowledge and hidden connections that can't be seen. That overlaps with conspiracy theory, but remember what witches are accused of doing. That's simply the function of the witch of the 18th century serving a modern purpose. And we repeat these things over and over again every day. Socially and culturally, American society is the biggest market for representations of witchcraft. Movies, for instance, made depicting witchcraft, 90% of them come from American Hollywood cinema. Only about 10% of them come from, or only about 5% of them come from Europe. The other 5% representing the entire other world in cultural depictions of this. It's something, for some reason, we are obsessed with. And I do think that historians like Richard Hofstadter are correct that part of the reason the idea of the witch lives on with us is because of our fascination and tendency toward conspiratorial thought, right? He called it the conspiratorial style in American politics, or the paranoid style. I think either applies, although conspiracy theory sounds better, because paranoid style sounds a little iffy. But also theologically, if we look at the behaviors associated with witchcraft, many of them have been retained, such as ecstatic worship. The idea of feeling pressure in the air once you've created this bond. This is something that evangelicals pick up in the First and Second Great Awakenings. The idea of ecstatic worship, or creating the Spirit of God, or as witches would have done it, the devil. This is something that Pentecostals, for instance, pick up with snake handling. Before 1800, if you'd seen a depiction of this, you would have immediately thought witchcraft. After 1900, you see this, and what's your first thought? It's probably an evangelical religious service, right? I've seen these things firsthand in East Tennessee. It's alive and well. It's just simply not associated with witchcraft anymore. They've taken the practice that used to be a taboo, and they've rebranded it for a new use, a new spiritual meaning, a new value. So we even see behaviors associated with witchcraft that have been modernized and readapted. Mostly you see aspects of this in things like our QAnon shaman here, right? I mean, this guy is a sign of things to worry about, but it's also essentially, and I don't want to bum you out, this is an American story. You've got the idea of the conspiracy at work, the hidden network of evil forces. You've got him literally invoking the shaman or the kind of pagan European magical possessor, and he's supposed to possess what? Hidden knowledge, hidden power, an antidote to the evil forces at work. It's like their idea of a good witch or good magic. So you even see this recreated in our political discourse. We don't think about it in those terms, but that doesn't mean it's not influencing how we live and talk and perceive reality. And in many ways, it just never went away. That's because we make witchcraft specifically something American, both in our depictions of it in popular culture and media, in the way that we refer to it in art and music, literature, but also in the way that we internalize some of the beliefs behind it. Conspiracy thinking, for instance, hidden knowledge, socially deviant behaviors, but subversiveness for its own sake, right, to correct a wrong that existed elsewhere in society. These are all concepts that are tied up with witchcraft in the early modern period, and today are tied up with notions of individualism, autonomy, alternative religious worship, Wicca, for instance, or modern paganism. Exponentially, the growth and interest in this is happening in the United States, almost nowhere else other than Western Europe, but even then the numbers are paltry compared per capita. Also, the conspiracy theory again, and I can't emphasize this enough. There's a new book coming out by a historian named Sarah, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, Nohrahm, Nohrahm. But her book is coming out later this year, and she has a new take on the conspiracy theory in American life and society, why it's so powerful in our belief systems. She spends quite a bit of time of talking about how we've maintained ideas of the witch and how we have no intention of getting rid of them because of the function they serve. And if we think about early American witchcraft, we think about the early modern period, I hope you'll take that away to remember not to feel ourselves superior because we don't share those beliefs, not to feel ourselves different because we're not motivated by those grievances or biases or hatreds or fears. We very much are. We just articulate them differently, we respond to them differently, and we perceive them in different places. But ultimately, it's a society looking for and afraid of the same thing. So that's something to keep in mind when you think about witchcraft. And that's all I have for you. Questions? Yeah?
You mentioned historian Richard Hofstadter?
Hofstadter, yeah.
Hofstadter? What would you recommend us read?
He's got an article form that eventually becomes a book. It's called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. Quintessential reading. It came out in the 1960s, and there's still been nothing better than that to explain quite a bit of the political and social phenomenon we see behind conspiracy theory. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the Catholic conspiracy, but you list out a lot of other conspiracies. Could you elaborate what those other conspiracies were about?
So do you want a specific time period? Do you want to give me like or you want me to give you like a timeline?
Things like, and I don't want to say the Jewish conspiracy, the slave conspiracy, those conspiracies.
Yeah.
What were they conspiracizing about? Because I know you were saying about the group.
So one of my favorites that I've been reading about lately is the conspiracy theory in the 1960s that getting rid of the gold standard was a conspiracy, that the International Global Bank was going to get America off of the gold-backed dollar so that they could ruin American wealth and eventually starve freedom. Yeah, it was a key component of Nixon's campaign in '68, and then Nixon actually gets rid of the gold standard, so kind of interesting political turn there. The 1990s, there's Ebola and AIDS, the conspiracy that AIDS was actually made in a CIA laboratory. In the 1980s, there's the crack epidemic. The CIA invented crack, as a way of keeping marginalized groups down. Americans toy with these ideas about just about anything. There's an incredible tension around in society. Some things we just prefer to blame on a bigger force than to look at inwardly. Yeah.
Are there any conspiracy theories that you believe?
That I believe?
Yeah.
That people believe in conspiracy theories. It's one of those things that becomes real, right? So if you think conspiracy theories are real, is QAnon real? Probably not. But the belief behind QAnon is very real and has already had real-world implications. So it depends on how you define it.
How strong was witch hunting in America compared to England? And did they standardize it like with King James book, or did they just make it up as they went?
Yeah, Cotton Mather and Increase Mather, father and son, they are the only Americans I know of that really try to do this. They want to be seen as the American intellectuals, especially regarding theological things, but since this overlaps, they also have a few of these where they try to establish that they're experts on it. And Cotton Mather, he's got a great one that he publishes in 1696, where he's basically critiquing the Salem witch trials, and I love it because his commentary on it is that You know where the Salem witch trials really went off the rails? It's not the spectral evidence. It's not the hearsay. It's not the torture to get confessions. It's that they accused an African slave of witchcraft, and I just don't think they're capable of it. That's when he thought it was a sham. Now everybody else, oh yeah, probably guilty. But, you know, and Cotton Mather's the expert. They even defer to him. John Ponder, one of the witch hunters, carries around these 3 giant volumes of the Malifia Malacarum, the witch's hammer, where he's kind of using these ancient advice on how to find them. He brings these around and he replaces one of those with Mather's treatise on it because he says, oh, this is the cutting edge science. So yes, but not what I would say holds up well. Yeah. I forgot about Cotton Mather. Thank you for bringing that up. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there other prominent examples of people using good magic or divination during that period, like during the period from like witchcraft trials through like Joseph Smith and all that?
Yeah, so Joseph Smith is, you know, he has a court record before he founds the Mormon Church because some of his divination didn't work out, right? He wasn't able to, and they convicted him of fraud. And this is later used by enemies of the Mormon Church to say, well, he must have been making that story up too, that kind of thing. But Smith is one of hundreds of people using divination just in upper New York in that time period of the early 1800s. He's doing it. So it's widely believed in. If the longer you go back in colonial history, the more prevalent it was. So for instance, in 1670, Mather estimates that there are maybe 10,000 diviners in New England. It's simply an accepted thing that some people are perceived to be able to do. It's not really questioned that it exists. It's really more about what you're using it for. So yeah, hundreds of cases. And those are just the ones we see show up in court because it doesn't work. We can assume that there were satisfied customers for some that never show up on the record. But we do have advertisements. People will put out newspaper ads. You know, when I look in my well, I can see messages about what's going to happen next week in town. So come by with your questions. It's, you know, 2 cents for a reading or something like that. That gets picked up with like the magic ball and the seance and that kind of medium in the 1880s and 90s. But that idea can be traced back all the way through colonial society, back into medieval England. Never goes away, simply changes its form a little. Accountants today, right?
I've read about and told a lot of people in this room about the like LSD derivatives in bread in New England. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, about whether it was ergot poisoning, ergot rotting or mold forming on it that then creates LSD. The problem with that is not all the town has the same food source. Puritans do practice communal food and communal property, but for it to have been from that same batch of ergot poisoning, everyone would have had to eat in that exact batch the same time on the same day. Plus, you're talking about effects that last hours. The trials go on for 1.5 years. It's very unlikely. Plus, even if that was ergot poisoning the whole time, they would have died from it if it had lasted longer than a day or two, right? So that was an interesting theory when that came out. I think Sarah Beth Norton talked about it in the 1990s, but I doubt it, you know. I don't know. It is a good explanation for at least how it might get started, but how it continues so long, very unlikely.
What's your opinion on that one?
Well, so The Crucible is based on Arthur Miller's play, right? And Arthur Miller writes that play as a critique of another form of witch hunt, right, which is the communist anti-Red Scare. So The Crucible is based on what's already a political commentary. So there's a bias going in right there. Number 2, it's not historically accurate, right? Abigail, the one that, I forget her name, but the main actress, Winona Ryder, the character she plays in the real history is like 8 years old, and John Proctor is like 51. So not quite a love story, you know? And so the movie takes a lot of liberties. And I'd remind you that the point behind that movie was a political commentary on political scapegoating. It wasn't really about, Salem was a lens, right, to view this other social phenomenon. But I mean, I enjoyed it. They don't throw early American historians a lot of bones in the movies, so, you know.
Piggybacking off that, are there any movies you think that are closely historically accurate?
Yeah, thank you. The Witch.
I was about to say about Robert Eggers.
A24's The Witch is the first time I've seen a non-popular culture depiction of what they thought witches actually did to get their power. I mean, it's obscene, it's vulgar, it's gory, it's hard to watch, but it is based on the idea that if you thought a witch happened, this is what you assumed she did to do it. And yeah, I thought it was a really, really historically hyper-accurate depiction. They even got the dialects right.
Yeah, I was really happy that you said that because the whole time watching this, I'm thinking of that movie and how she goes into the forest and does the dance
Yeah.
at the end of the film, and like they're all doing.
She got to fly without a familiar stick, but otherwise it's the, yeah.
You could be sent to jail with a simple accusation for witchcraft, but were there any accusations that they just were like, no, like this can't be?
It's harder to say. Most of the historical record I've based the talk on today has been from court records. So if a charge was dropped, it was expunged after 7 years. If a charge was simply seen as not worth bringing, it never actually makes it onto the record. So the likely answer is yes. The unfortunate also kind of asterisk to that is it'd be hard for me to prove it because it doesn't show up in the written records of what we have access to. But if you just look at it as a numbers game, almost certainly, you know, there would have been some that were just not taken seriously. How much time do we have? Yeah, thanks so much for having me.